Good morning, everyone, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues. Warm welcome on behalf of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Welcome to the Maison de la Paix, the House of Peace, and the GCSP. We are immensely delighted to be convening this conversation here this morning on preparing for the Summit of the Future. What role and indeed future is there for multilateralism? My name is Annika Hilding Norberg. I'm head of peace operations, peace building here at the GCSP. More interesting, though, is the purpose for which we have gathered here this morning: to prepare for the future. More specifically, the Summit of the Future. And the initiative of the United Nations Secretary-General, the Summit of the Future, will be held in September 2024 with the purpose to make peace possible, war less probable, and people and planet safe and secure. It's indeed a tall order, especially given the current and ever deteriorating state of world affairs. Indeed, we are witnessing a toxic mixture of increased inequalities, exclusion, and polarization. Violence, conflict, and the all-out war on Ukraine are also fueled and accelerated by the climate crisis, new technologies, and the unpredictable powers of artificial intelligence. We are on the eve of whatever is about to come. So how can we meet, or at least mitigate, the current political, security, socioeconomic, and environmental degradation and downward spiral of development? Required is a multilateral system which is fit for purpose, for all of us to be able to step up to meet the challenges of our time. This, ladies and gentlemen, will be the focus of our conversation this morning. As I hope all of you will know, Switzerland joined the UN Security Council 1st of January this year, and will soon assume the presidency for the first time on Monday, I believe. So a number of organizations have been mandated to support the efforts to promote the dialogue on new agenda for peace and how that contributes. So this meeting here this morning is part of such an effort to promote and engage on the topic of promoting the new agenda for peace. Also, the conversation we believe is extremely timely, not only for the policy brief that we will soon be speaking of, but also, as you will know, that only a few days ago, the report by the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism was launched. And we're delighted also to be joined. I will soon introduce our distinguished speakers this morning, but also by Adam Day, who was one of the key persons in the Secretariat for that report. But now, preparing for the Summit of the Future in 2024, what role and future is there for multilateralism? And to do this, we have been joined by an outstanding panel of two senior experts on the topic and one policy brief, which is hot off the press this morning. First out, to introduce the core content and central analysis of the policy brief we are launching today is Richard Gowan, the UN Director of the International Crisis Group. And Richard, of course, wonderful to see you here again at the GCSP. Richard is an old friend and associate partner of the GCSP. So warm welcome back. And of course, Richard needs no introduction. But just to say that I know no one who has followed the UN Security Council politics and proceedings in such an insightful and steadfast way for so long. Speaking practically daily to all members of the UN Security Council. So I figure you can possibly be considered as the 16th ex-officio member of the Security Council. Thank you again for your frank and always instructive engagement on these topics. Following Richard's initial intervention, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Director of the GCSP and former Secretary-General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, will share his thoughts on the future of multilateralism specifically reflecting on Richard's analysis and propositions. Ambassador Grumming, having served in several of the most senior positions, both in the multilateral system as well as a member state representative, he will bring to bear his deep and multifaceted background as a policymaker and diplomat, and development and human security official, research and military background. So there's a lot of knowledge on the podium, and also we warmly welcome the active participation in the conversation that will follow, both of course to have some comments from Adam on the report and how he thinks it's reflected in Richard's analysis and the ambassador's analysis, but also it is extraordinary to see the participation in the room. And this is what, from my perspective, I think the wonderful part of International Geneva and the community here. We have senior member state representatives from the permanent missions. We have representatives from the UN agencies. Also our partners in the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, who is also focused very much on this area. And think tanks and NGOs. So, colleagues, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annika, and thank you to everyone for turning out bright and early on a Friday to think about the future. It's a pleasure to be back at GCSP, my first trip back here since the COVID pandemic, and it was a real privilege to work with you and your colleagues on this short report with the somewhat portentous title, The Future of Multilateralism. I must say, if the future of multilateralism is this short, we're in trouble.
We took out the question mark, just so you know.
This is a good opportunity, I think, for me, coming from New York, to talk with you and hear from you about your expectations for the Summit of the Future. The big international conclave on reshaping global governance that Secretary-General Guterres has scheduled for September 2024. And I imagine that this thing, the Summit of the Future, is a discussion point in Geneva. But I would also imagine that what the summit is and what the summit will achieve is probably not entirely clear to you. And I have to say that wouldn't be very surprising because it isn't very clear to your diplomatic counterparts in New York. Secretary-General Guterres promised us this summit in his 2021 report, Our Common Agenda. And Our Common Agenda, which is the baseline for all current UN reform efforts, set out a very broad set of challenges to the international community, covering everything from reforming the international financial institutions to accelerating the fight against climate change, to really just changing the way we think about international cooperation. Guterres, for example, said that we should be focusing more on future generations and how our policy decisions today affect those who will be born in decades to come. I mean, this was an intellectually compelling document, but it was so broad that it has, I think, been difficult for the diplomatic community in New York to really get a grip on what can be achieved now and what can be achieved over the next 18 months in terms of translating these big challenges and big ideas into actual policy change at the UN. In preparation for the summit, your colleagues in New York are currently involved in 13 different intergovernmental processes. This September alone, there will be 8 high-level conferences in September 2023, in the week of the General Assembly. There is an enormous amount of diplomatic activity, but it's running on many, many different tracks. And I think there is a certain degree of chaos, frankly, around this sort of multi-track process. And so I think the challenge that we now feel is how do we ensure that the Summit of the Future, this chance to address the state of multilateralism, is actually focused and actually delivers real change. There is a risk that all this diplomatic activity will not cohere into a sort of real move forward in terms of strengthening multilateralism. Now, I am not competent to talk about many of the tracks, for example, the tracks around international financial institutions, but I have been focusing, and I focus in this report, on one track of discussions leading up to the summit, which is how do we strengthen the international architecture for maintaining peace and security. And the question of how we strengthen the UN architecture in the peace and security realm has become one of the main priorities, I think, in discussions on what can be achieved through the Summit of the Future. This was not guaranteed to be the case. When Guterres released our common agenda, he was primarily focused on the lessons of the pandemic. And if you read our common agenda, there is a lot about the need to fight future pandemics. There's a lot about climate change. There's actually very little on peace and security. And back in 2021, I think that the Secretary-General thought that the main focus for strengthening international cooperation should not be peace and security. It should instead be fighting global threats such as disease. And had Russia not launched its all-out war on Ukraine in February of last year, I don't think peace and security would be a significant element of the discussion on UN reform today. But the moment that Russia did launch its assault on Kiev, it suddenly became very clear that it would be, frankly, silly to talk about the state of the international system without addressing problems of peace and security. And so over the last year, there has been a growing focus on how we reinforce the international security system. And that is an important feature of the recent report of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. And it's also going to be the focus of a report that Mr. Guterres will release in June that's called A New Agenda for Peace. And so peace and security issues have come back into the middle of reform debates at the UN. The fact that peace and security issues are in focus does not, however, make it easy to say what we can do to really strengthen multilateral cooperation around security issues. There are obviously a number of very significant challenges to international security cooperation today. And in this policy brief, I identify what I see as 4 main challenges to the UN in the realm of peace and security. The first of those, and I think the most obvious, is what Annika referred to, the rapid and long-term decline of major power relations. Back in the 1990s, when Secretary-General Guterres released his report, An Agenda for Peace, there was a sense that the great powers were coming together, and there was a sense that the UN could move forward in an era of great power cooperation. 30 years later, the new Agenda for Peace is going to be released at a moment when the big powers are coming apart. And it is very challenging to see how you can make major steps forward in terms of international security cooperation when China, Russia, and the US are so profoundly at odds. That's one challenge, but it's by no means the only challenge. I think if you switch attention away from great power politics, you see that the UN is also struggling with many conflicts in regions such as the Sahel and the Great Lakes in Africa, where traditional UN security tools like peacekeeping operations and mediation efforts are not delivering peace. Today, we have a peacekeeping crisis in the Sahel. We have UN peacekeepers in Mali who are frankly overwhelmed by jihadi attacks and have deteriorating relations with the host government. There is a similar peacekeeping crisis emerging in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In other circumstances, we would be focusing on these challenges to the blue helmets. We're not, because we're thinking about Ukraine. But the UN's traditional tools for addressing civil wars and resolving intra-state conflicts are also under a huge amount of strain. The third challenge that we face is the challenge of the future. And the future is coming at us quite fast now. Technological changes are rapidly reshaping the landscape of international peace and security. We've already, in the last decade, seen drones go from being something that a small number of nations used to now being a common feature of warfare in places such as the South Caucasus and Ethiopia. But drones are almost old hat nowadays. We don't have any, by the way, we don't have any mechanisms for regulating drone warfare, but drones are slipping into the past. We're seeing the rise of lethal autonomous weapon systems, we're seeing the rise of artificial intelligence as a weapon of war, and we just don't have the mechanisms at the multilateral level to regulate how these weapons are used. So we face challenges ranging from dealing with jihadist insurgents in Mali through to the rise of artificial intelligence. And the UN is meant to deal with all these challenges at once. And then there's a fourth challenge, a slightly less tangible challenge, and that's about the values that should guide how we deal with all these threats to international peace and security. Over the last 30 years, we've seen the UN develop, I think, a sort of unprecedented array of normative frameworks for thinking about how we deal with security threats. The human rights architecture has ballooned here. The Women, Peace and Security agenda has developed to a remarkable extent in New York. These normative agendas have guided how we think about how we deal with conflict. But these normative agendas are all under pressure. I mean, those of you who work around the Human Rights Council know the divisions that now exist over human rights. In New York, the Security Council members don't dare table resolutions on women, peace and security issues now because that is so divisive in the Security Council. So I think a fourth challenge that runs alongside the others that I describe is to work out how we protect the values that we believe in through the multilateral system. And Thomas, I think you saw that very much in the OSCE as well, another values-based organization where a lot of values are under pressure. So this is a rather daunting scene. What can we do about it? Well, the UN is the UN, so the first thing that everyone thinks about is institutional reform. And there has, in the last year, slightly more than a year, since Russia's assault on Ukraine, suddenly been a lot of a talk about, can we change, the baseline institutions of the UN? And can we alter the UN Charter to face current realities? There's been a lot of talk, at least in New York, of Security Council reform. And I see some eyes being rolled, and I think that's probably right. But President Biden encouraged talk of Security Council reform at the General Assembly last September when he said that the US would like to see Council reform. That set off a certain diplomatic frenzy in Turtle Bay. But to be quite honest, I think that the more people and the more your colleagues have looked at the possibilities for reforming the Security Council, the more they've realized that that is almost impossible at the present time. And actually, the focus in New York is already shifting away from reforming the Security Council to the question of whether it is possible to make serious reforms to the IMF and the World Bank that would give greater rights and greater powers to developing countries. And so I think that the possibility of actually reforming the UN Charter, reforming the Security Council, is sadly still very far out of reach. Although I think that will be a source of disappointment and a source of disillusion to certain countries such as India and Brazil that do want to see fundamental council reform. In the absence of council reform, what is possible? Well, here we turn to the very interesting report of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism and Adam Day that was published in mid-April. And the High-Level Advisory Board goes into some depth into both how we deal with current security challenges and how we deal with future security challenges. The report, which I'm sure many of you have read, is a very interesting document, and it works at two levels. At one level, it tells us what we would do if we lived in a perfect and rational world to reform the international security system. So it does say we should reform the Security Council. It argues that we should move to total nuclear disarmament. It argues that we should reform here in Geneva the voting structures of the Conference on Disarmament to make it easier to move towards denuclearization. And these, I think, are fine and rational goals. However, just as Security Council reform is very unlikely, it is also very unlikely that we will move towards total nuclear disarmament anytime soon. And it's probably even less likely that you can reform the voting structures of the Conference on Disarmament. These are big goals, but they're not necessarily realistic goals in the immediate term. But what the High-Level Advisory Board also sets out is a second strand of thinking that is more pragmatic and focuses on what could actually be done in the near term. And so in addition to talking about Security Council reform, it argues that we should strengthen the Human Rights Council and we should give the Human Rights Council a greater role in prevention. It also argues that we should strengthen the Peacebuilding Commission in New York, which is a space where states can collaborate on conflict prevention in a less confrontational manner than in the Security Council. Similarly, in addition to talking about the Conference on Disarmament, the report suggests that the Secretary-General should establish a new working group made up of civil and military experts to look at pathways to nuclear use and nuclear risk that could provide pragmatic advice on how to reduce nuclear dangers. And it sets out a series, I think, of very realistic, if still challenging ideas about setting up new working groups and new diplomatic formats to at least address the risks of new technologies like artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so if you haven't read the report, I urge you to look at that, but I urge you not just to look at the big headlines in there, but also look at these more pragmatic suggestions. But the report doesn't cover all security issues, and it leaves some of them to the document that is coming up in June, the New Agenda for Peace. And I think the New Agenda for Peace is also going to have to lay out some concrete ideas about what the UN can do, less in terms of institutional change and more in terms of dealing with some of the conflict challenges we face today. I think one of the major questions in the report is what we do in places such as the Sahel, where our current security tools are underperforming. And I think one major focus for the Secretary-General will be seeing if it is possible for the UN to set up a new mechanism, a new funding mechanism, which would allow the Security Council to authorize funding for the African Union's peace operations in regions such as the Sahel and Horn of Africa. That, we know, is a personal priority for the Secretary-General. I think the report is also going to have to address what UN peace operations and what the UN peacekeeping architecture should look like, given some of the weaknesses that it has demonstrated in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think we're probably going to be talking about moving away from big blue helmet operations of the type that you can see in the Central African Republic today towards lighter weight interventions, more flexible models of peace operations, such as the mission that the UN currently has deployed in Colombia, supporting the peace process there quite successfully. So I think these are some of the issues that are going to be in the new Agenda for Peace. I also think that the new Agenda for Peace will reinforce the High-Level Advisory Board's emphasis on pragmatic approaches to arms control. I think that this is a moment for the UN to promote what I would call counter-cyclical thinking on arms control. I mean, right now, in most major capitals, people are thinking about increasing military budgets, increasing military postures. The UN does not have to go with that tide. And actually, I think at a moment when we're talking about arming up, it's important that the UN and organizations such as UNIDIR here in Geneva swim against the tide and actually talk about what arms controls mechanisms will be necessary and possible in a more dangerous world. Finally, the new Agenda for Peace is going to have to address the question of values, and especially to address the backsliding we're seeing on normative agendas like the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And there is concern, frankly, amongst diplomats in New York that this isn't a focus in discussions leading up to the Summit of the Future. But I think that concern is being heard, and I hope that the new Agenda for Peace will talk about the fact, as the High-Level Advisory Board also does, that we need, frankly, to get serious about women's participation in peace processes and women's participation in politics. Because we've talked about that for a long time, but we're still very far behind where we should be. And so I think that the new agenda for peace should be a rallying cry to actually live up to our normative commitments. So those are the sort of things I think that we can get out of this process. Is it enough? No, frankly. Given the very dangerous world that we live in, it would be better if we could live up to the higher ideals of the high-level advisory board, and we could reform the Security Council, and we could reform multilateralism. But that isn't going to happen in the current political environment. And so I think that what we need to do is bring together some of the ideas that we're talking about here today into a package of limited but still useful reforms that at least address some of the immediate risks we face. As I say in the report, whenever we talk about UN reform, someone will always stand up and say, this is no time for half measures. Well, my argument is that this is precisely the time for half measures. At a moment of great power tension, a moment of deep rifts, we cannot expect fundamental reform to the multilateral system, but we can take a lot of half measures that will at least paper over some of the cracks in what we have. And that, I think, is our challenge going forward into 2024.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that. I realized that being pragmatic maybe is the new bold. Who knows? So thank you so much for that very...
I thought you said bold for a second. That was
well, that too. But no, thank you so much for that, for really this very informative, instructive, and as always, thought-provocative meeting. I also want to congratulate my colleagues, because I have Tobias Wester and Mareva, who is, of course, part of developing the policy brief or supporting the development of that. So thank you so much for raising a number of host of issues, not only the challenges, but also some thoughts on what to do about them. I will linger no further, but of course there's a whole host of issues, especially speaking to peace operations and so on, that I find particularly interesting. But now, of course, it is my absolute pleasure to hand over the word for some first comments, reflections, thoughts by Ambassador Greminger.
Yeah, thank you, Annika. I would like to start out by thanking Richard for being with us and for drafting this brilliant policy brief. I think we've been publishing good policy briefs lately, and congrats to the Applied Research and Policy Advice team at GCSP. But I think this policy brief, I must say, beats them all. It's I think you will be with me once you have read it. I think it's really, well, it's in a way, it's breaking news in the sense of helping us understand where we are on our way to the summit for the future. And this, I think, in a very good way, I think it's, you know, in a way, it's a sobering assessment, but at the same time, it's also encouraging. And I think, and this, of course, in a very good moment, just a week after this brilliant report of the high-level advisory board has been published, and congrats, Adam, to this. It's really impressive. I haven't really, you know, read it carefully, I must admit, but screening through, I'm impressed, and also I'm impressed by you know, what Richard pointed out, that this two-pronged approach of being super ambitious on the one hand, but then also, you know, on a, I would say, more pragmatic level, proposing a number of issues, proposals, etc., that are somehow within reach, that, you know, carry some sort of realism. So, and the second aspect is obviously when it comes to the new agenda for peace. You know, we've been here working quite extensively on an attempt to bridge the gap between Geneva and New York in trying to mobilize the expertise of international Geneva and convey it to drafters in New York. I think this has been so far an exercise with, I would say, mixed success, but at least we tried hard. And in that sense, also this gathering this morning is a small contribution to trying to, strengthen this bridge between Geneva and New York. Just a couple of thoughts on substance, but this is really, Richard's. I know you have come to listen to Richard, so I'm going to be very brief. Just, perhaps a couple of reflections on the mindset that, I would advise us to take in the run-up to the summit for the future. I think there is a risk, of course, that we would be guided by despair. We have an ongoing war in the heart of Europe. We have geopolitical rivalries that seem to spin out of control. We have this crisis of multilateralism that seems to somehow be ongoing. There is, if you look around, there is little significant political leadership, in terms of, again, bringing the solution of the most urgent global problems to multilateral fora. There is little leadership around. So, one could be tempted to say, okay, well, this is going to be an uphill battle with little prospect of achieving anything tangible. It will be an uphill battle, clearly. That is for sure. But I think because the situation is so challenging, I think we have no other option than to try to use this as an opportunity. And I think, again, the high-level advisory panel report, and now the shaping of the new agenda for peace represent, and then of course the ensuing discussion of these documents, they represent a unique opportunity that we should seize. This will not be easy, because there is of course a high risk that we will be dominated, that our energy, our attention will be absorbed by the daily crisis management. And this is particularly true. We had last night an E10 UN Security Council discussion at the Swiss ambassador's residence, and I'm a bit afraid, that there is going to be that we 98% of our attention, of our resources, are going to be, taken by, for instance, making sure that the grain deal is not going to fall apart. That we manage to just simply uphold some of the most important peace operations and stuff like that, and that we kind of miss then the chance to, focus on structures, focus on the future. Well, I promise to be brief, so I better stick to my ambition. Just on what do I think should we try to aim at? What do I think is in the cards or should be in the cards? I think we clearly should position the UN, the multilateral system, in regarding the strategic stability agenda. This is something that, of course, concerns the P5, but it concerns all UN members. And I think here we should be ambitious. Realistic, yes, but we should be ambitious, and I think in Richard's policy brief, you see a couple of avenues that are suggested in that direction. We should position the UN the multilateral system in general in tackling key transnational threats, starting, of course, with climate change, mitigating, adapting to climate change. But beyond that, you know, there are a number of transnational threats that can all be dealt with by international cooperation. And here, I think the Summit for the Future should, you know, send a clear signal that you can only deal effectively with these transnational challenges by having a strong performing multilateral system. And I think climate change, you know, organized crime, cyber, and then of course, and this is a third point that I would like to make, emerging disruptive technologies. I think here it's very important, you know, that we not only deal with the benefits of emerging technologies, but also ready to, you know, regulate the risks of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum, human augmentation. I think these issues the UN needs to start dealing with seriously. And last but not least, I think indeed when it comes to institutional reform, I think we should be ambitious enough to be willing to tackle institutional reform. But then again, yeah, I don't believe in reforming the UN Security Council. I think there I would advocate to focus on strengthening the UN General Assembly. I think that would be wiser. But I think what is somehow, I find in the cards, perhaps I'm too much of an optimist, is, you know, the Peace Building Commission. A bit like, you know, like we did 20 years ago when we started reforming the UN Human Rights Commission. That was a process that then led to something much more powerful today. And that was, by the way, a Swiss initiative that, you know, back then. And this could be combined with some sort of a UPR for conflict prevention. And I think these are ideas that somehow are very ambitious, but I think they're in the cards. That's up here.
All right, thank you so much, Ambassador, for that equally insightful and, of course, bringing to the forefront or reminding us also of the complementary ecosystems between New York and Geneva, and where, as we move forward and trying to address these increasingly hardening security issues, to address them, we also need to look to the UN family of agencies and expertise in Geneva and connect the two. So wonderful. We're going to open the floor to conversations quickly. There's lots. Can I just, I wanted to invite Adam Day, because of course they just came out of presenting the other report, which is very complimentary. A few reflections.
Yeah, I think we don't have anybody online, so I can speak without a speaker that's it'll get picked up. Great. I mean, first, I think this is a remarkable document because it's so short and yet has so much in it and is also very readable, which is an almost impossible combination. And I think congratulations to GCSP for getting Richard to write this. So it's really, I learned a lot, even though I've been working on this for the last several years. So definitely read it. It also reminded me, Richard, of another piece you wrote a few years ago called Minimum Order, which was a deeper dive into the art of the possible for the Security Council and geopolitics. And I think that was quite prescient in teeing up where we are today. So I'd encourage everyone to read that too. I think just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that peace and security isn't on the front line of the common agenda. It's not on the front line of the high-level advisory board report either. It's actually number 5 of 6 shifts. And I think to a certain extent that reflects the moment. You mentioned it was the COVID moment when common agenda came out. We grappled with the fact that during the report writing for this, Ukraine happened. And suddenly everybody wanted to talk about nuclear weapons, whereas that wasn't at all the starting point. And you'll see in the report there's actually a big chunk on nuclear. Izumi Nakamitsu from the Office of Disarmament Affairs is holding a whole discussion just up the lake on that issue today as well. And then Security Council reform comes into play because of Biden's announcement. So I think it's important to note the moment that's captured when these reports come out. So the COVID moment of the common agenda is no longer the dominant issue, although the emergency platform and other things are, and we are in another moment now. So I think because of that, to a certain extent, the Common Agenda, the High-Level Advisory Report, and possibly the new Agenda for Peace might end up having a hole in it. And I think, Thomas, you identified that hole, which is something around cyber warfare, emerging tech risks. If I had to pick one major destabilizing potential act right now, it would probably be a large-scale cyber attack on European infrastructure coming out of the Russian conflict. The High-Level Advisory Report makes some references to it. The Common Agenda makes some light references to it. I don't think that these issues of needing a space for deconfliction, needing a kind of governance discussion are proportionate to the problem right now. And so I think that is a whole, I think in this, it's mentioned in this policy brief too. I think what the High-Level Advisory Board report tries to do around that issue of emerging tech is to identify who needs to be involved in what type of process. So there's a, shift one is actually potentially the most transformative, which talks about the need to more meaningfully involve the private sector, cities, industry in some of these big multilateral processes. And also, I think the focus on the global financial architecture is a kind of backdoor to some of these security issues. And I'd say the most ambitious set of recommendations there is actually on the financial side, not on the security side. But if you read the financial stuff, you'll see there's an underpinning desire to move funding away from militarization and towards other issues. So I think you're also right, Richard, on the kind of lack of a vision on peace enforcement. I don't think it's there in the Common Agenda. I don't think it's there in the High-Level Advisory Report. I'm not sure if it'll be there in the new Agenda for Peace. We'll see. You wrote another piece called The Peacekeeping Quagmire a few years ago, and I think that actually captures where we are. We're still in a quagmire, and there are no good answers to it. You're probably right that the long-term trajectory is towards smaller, lighter missions, but in the meantime, we're stuck with 5 pretty big ones, and stuck is probably the right word. So the response that Secretary-General, I think, has taken, that the High-Level Advisory Board has taken, is to focus on regionalism and supporting regionally led conflict prevention. Now, the SG's approach is to this idea of assessed contributions for the African Union. The High-Level Advisory Board stayed at that higher level and made a recommendation that Thomas would hopefully appreciate, that we need a kind of Helsinki-style process for the UN's relationship with regional organizations. So what created the SCSE and the OSCE, that multi-pronged 3-pillar approach to create a more strategic relationship and funding for regional organizations, I think is the starting point for maybe deepening subsidiarity and the role of regional organizations. But it's a starting point, not at all a prescription that's going to solve the problem. So the final thought I had, I think you're absolutely right that no one knows what the Summit of the Future is going to be. Thomas got one thing completely wrong. And he calls it the Summit for the Future, not the Summit of the Future. But I think that's actually what we should be thinking about as what it should be. Rather than thinking about a Summit of the Future where we treat the future as an entity to be commented on, we should think of it, as you described it, Summit for the Future, thinking about what can we do for future generations. And I actually think that could be a helpful pivot. Instead of trying to shoehorn the 13 tracks into the Summit of the Future and land financial reform and Security Council reform and whatever, the 67 recommendations, which, by the way, yesterday in conversations led by the President of the General Assembly on the High-Level Advisory Board report, there was a strong complaint about the Common Agenda process overall, that it's got too much. It's got too many things. It's too much of a distraction from the SDG summit. There's a potential that the G77 actually refuses to participate in future events that aren't related to the SDG summit until that happens. So I actually think that, Thomas, your phrase, Summit for the Future, could point to a role in the Declaration for Future Generations that's much more normative, more like a universal declaration of human rights, much more just a statement that future generations matter, that it's for future generations, and then the other change cascades from that normative moment. And I think, Richard, your close in this paper around norms and values is the right one. And there's a great piece by Anne-Marie Slaughter and Thomas Hale that makes a little bit of reference to this. It's called What Should the Summit of the Future Be? But I think trying not to shoehorn everything into that moment is probably a helpful starting point for dealing with some of the issues that Richard raises and some of the problems that we see in addressing all of this at once. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for that, Adam, for elaborating a little bit further on some of the key points of that report. And I must say, though, that there's more people who should take credit for that, because I think that the first draft from Richard came Summit for the Future, and I thought, oh, this is so interesting, this is excellent. So we changed everything around. So I think that it's in a way it speaks to the future, and of course this is where we're heading. This is the planning. This is the focus. So, colleagues, we're opening up the floor. We had a first. Yes, if you can please state your name and your organization.
My name is Ana Balcázar Moreno. I'm a PhD researcher at the Graduate Institute next door. So actually I have two questions. The first one is how to do with the limited time attention and also the various crises popping up. So it seems like there is a question of setting priorities. So for allocation of these limited resources. And for instance, yes, I understand that the crisis between Russia and Ukraine changed, in a way, the focus on the pandemic. But actually, the pandemic is not over. So we're still having spillovers. We're still having all the factors that will reproduce this kind of health crisis. So what to do about this? And the second one will be, you're talking about the creation of new institutions, while also reforming the current ones. But then we're still having the problem of the backlash of multilateralism. So what to do with this? How we can justify the creation of new institutions when member states, in a way, they resist that. So now, just now recently, the member states of WHO, finally, they are going to talk about the increase of the allocated contributions. But this is after years of having the same allocated contributions. What to do with this? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that important question. If you agree, we'll take a few. Is that all right? Do you need a paper or you remember? Okay, excellent. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Tancredi Francese. I'm DPR of Italy to the Conference on Disarmament. Thank you very much for the report and for the conversation we had just started. And I'd like to ask if, Mr. Bowen, if you can expand a little more on what you call the counter-cyclical thinking on arms control, especially when it comes to the challenge that we face to deal with both traditional issues like nuclear and new challenges, especially the cyber was mentioned, and very interesting to that. And what's the role for multilateralism in that? Ambassador Geminger said that strategic stability is not just a matter for P5, but, well, we see a little bit their attitude to try to deal with this in a different style. So what's the role for multilateralism in that today, in your opinion? Thank you.
Wonderful. And let's take a third one.
Thank you. I'm Cristian Espinosa. I'm the PR of Ecuador to the UN here in Geneva. I had yesterday the opportunity to talk to the gentleman at the panel, and I learned a lot. But there is something that hasn't been mentioned either this morning or last night, and is the sense that developing countries have in their mind, which is the growing inequality. Growing inequality that is not necessarily an inequality between the wealth of the wealthy countries versus the non-wealthy countries, but an inequality that is being concentrated in certain key actors. We have the budget of the World Health Organization every time depending more and more on very few donors than even the budget that is provided by member countries of the organization. We have the risks of high technology that are not necessarily coming from investment or development that comes from national governments, but for individuals, companies, wealth that is being concentrated at very high amounts of level with the capacity to affect peace and security. Mr. Musk himself can have an effect on these things. And in other areas, like in Latin America, wealth that is being concentrated in organized crime, drug cartels, also in very few hands, with the capacity to influence peace and security situation in the region. in a significant way, much more than what national armies can do in certain occasions. So that inequality brings risk right now and probably in the future. And I don't see in the discussion a proposal to deal with this factor. So if you can have a word on that, I will find it very, very, very useful.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Shall we, who wants to go first? We'll take, I see there are more hands up, but let's just hang on a second and...
Well, yeah, perhaps on the question, of course, it's a very legitimate question. Why would we want to create new institutions while we see old ones not functioning properly? I think that's. I think it's just the nature of the multilateral system. Something that doesn't work, cannot be abolished. It will somehow go on for years, even if it's totally dysfunctional and not performing, etc. And there are just bodies that you cannot reform. And then instead of trying to invest all your time and energy in trying to do something that is not achievable, I think there is a temptation, and perhaps it makes sense to create something in parallel. And look, that was my experience when I saw in the OEC that the Permanent Council was totally blocked, had become totally sterile, confrontational. What did we try to do? We tried to create informal structures and bodies like the structured dialogue, but also, smaller informal spaces. Partly this worked, but partly, of course, this hit then the same resistances that you also see in the formal system. So it's not, the silver bullet, but it can be a useful approach. Yeah, this is why I said before, I would try to strengthen the UN General Assembly, while I understand Indians and Brazilians, why they would want to reform the Security Council. Or, well, when it comes to the Peace-Building Commission, I think it's not about creating a new institution. It's about giving the institution another hierarchical level in the entire system and provide the institution with new tools. So I think that's what I would advocate. On the counter-cyclical, or you want to come in on this? On the counter-cyclical thinking in arms control. Look, fact is that today the world security order, the European security order, of course, but also the global security order is very much dominated by deterrence. And I'm afraid this is here to stay. And in a way, it's also legitimate. We have, again, a major country that tries to change border by military force, and this needs to be countered. And there is no, immediate perspective that this threat is going to go away. So what is the response? It's deterrence. But at the same time, I think we, and this is, I think, the call for thinking counter-cyclically, is we need to think and reflect arms control. Well, on the one hand, in conventional terms, and in nuclear terms, for a time that will hopefully come, and that is a post-war period. But we also need to think, arms control in terms of arms control writ large, in terms of these emerging technologies that we have referred to. And I think, and here I see a chance for the UN. And again, to come back to the previous discussion, if we realize, that the Conference of Disarmament is dysfunctional, does not produce anything, at the same time, the Conference of Disarmament brings a lot of expertise to Geneva. So we have lots of experts here. Well, use them, bring them together, let them reflect on things that matter. Ambassador, your point on the growing inequality, I think this is an extremely fundamental one. I think it's the answers are well, at first sight, perhaps obvious, but then, of course, their practicality is questionable. I mean, when it comes to the funding of multilateral institutions, clearly a multilateral institution that depends to a large extent by voluntary contributions is necessarily in the hands of a very few. And I saw this also in the OEC, you know, that, and this was the trend. We had over 10 years a zero nominal growth co-budget, and whatever happened, you know, in an innovative, in a new sense, had to be financed by extra budgetary resources offered by perhaps 6 to 10 countries. And I think that's exactly what you see in a number of UN bodies that depend. I mean, I think UNODC depends to 90% by extra budgetary funding. I mean, this is, I think this is kind of not sustainable for a multilateral body. To change that, of course, is very difficult, because those, you know, that have money are not really keen. They don't have a lot of appetite to increase their contributions to multilateral institutions, which, you know, takes me back to this lack of also political leadership. People that really believe in the multilateral system and say you can't have a performing multilateral system without heavily investing in it intellectually, but also financially in terms of human resources. On the emerging technology issue, you know, I would point to the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Accelerator, where we, you know, try to anticipate what are, you know, effects of science breakthroughs in 5, 10, and 20 years, and try to anticipate them and try to reflect about how to regulate them. And here, clearly, there is an attempt to make this an inclusive reflection where everybody, you know, comes in, not only those few states that are most advanced in these technologies. I mean, that's a small attempt, I admit, but still I think it's important. We have just launched an initiative together with Columbia University, Chester, and the GCSP to kind of apply this same logic. What is going to happen in 5, 10, and 20 years when it comes to the future of peace and war? And here again, you know, we try to bring in not only those that are most advanced in these technologies, but to have everybody, to have an inclusive approach in reflecting, you know, how then to kind of try to mitigate, try to contain, try to regulate those negative aspects that we anticipate.
Thank you so much. Richard.
I mean, I echo everything Thomas said. The colleague who asked about global health has left, but I would emphasize that global health is not off the agenda. And if you look at the high-level advisory board, there's a lot on global health there. I'm simply not an expert on that field, so I don't know what the prospects for major reforms to the global health architecture are, but it certainly hasn't been forgotten, and perhaps there is more space for progress there than on peace and security issues. On arms control, look, I mean, I think Thomas is absolutely right. We're not talking about setting up new institutions, we're talking about developing dialogues, developing frameworks for discussion around the existing institutions. And that's definitely something where Geneva can be central, because you do have a pool of expertise on arms issues here that can be drawn on. Something else that is mentioned in this report, but also in the high-level board report, is there's also a need to talk about transparency in international security relations. We have seen the decline of, you know, post-Cold War transparency mechanisms like the Open Skies Treaty. Countries are actually increasingly falling behind on their reporting under the Arms Trade Treaty. and other UN frameworks. Something that the high-level board suggests is setting up some sort of new UN mechanism. It's not very clearly defined, but that would sort of work on revitalizing security transparency. And actually, there are many ways, innovative ways, that the UN could increase transparency around arms sales and related issues. Some of that from member state reporting, but also a lot of it from civil society reporting. I mean, the amount of data that is now available on arms issues is huge. And so I think at this moment in time, there would be value in boosting transparency around military issues. And as one of my colleagues at Crisis Group says, that in many ways is entirely compatible with deterrence, because you deter people if they know what weapons you've got. So actually, you can argue for promoting security transparency alongside deterrence too. Ambassador, your question is much too hard for 10 in the morning. I mean, the only way we can really break Elon Musk's influence is to get him to buy more social media platforms. But to me, the challenge of the super rich is something that has to be worked out within states and democracies. It can't really be resolved at the multilateral level. But where you refer to organized crime, the high-level board touches on this. I don't touch on this, but there is a lot more space for multilateral cooperation on dealing with organized crime, and that at least could be of some value in regions such as Latin America, where it's actually still a much greater threat than a lot of sort of the risks of interstate conflict. So I don't have an answer, but it is a huge challenge.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, we have several colleagues. So okay, this is going to be. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's it. So be concise and to the point to share the space with everybody. Yes.
Yeah. Just a few points, and I've written them down, so hopefully I won't waffle too much. Thank you, Richard, for the document, and as Adam said, it's concise and full of interesting ideas. I think a couple of points on sort of the space of the UN in the future. I think we need to be quite sanguine about the new space that the UN has been in for a while now, and I think we've been fighting it rather than leaning into it. I think the report makes sort of hints at it by adding a lot of other stakeholders in that. So I think I really welcome that idea of trying to be quite sort of lucid about that space, and humility and integrity when it comes to the international laws and norms as well. So member states within it really need to be quite honest about how they have trespassed international law and potentially been part of the problem, not just part of the solution. I have a question about new institutions that are being suggested, and I think we've heard this for the past 3 months around the new Agenda for Peace, this new UPR for prevention. There are existing human rights mechanisms that are underused, and I would invite people to consider how the Peace-Building Commission, if that's a space where states trust that discussion to take place, to really see what the human rights institutions as they currently exist could do more of. We have a whole report on how the UPR can do sustaining peace. Happy to share that with those who are interested. It's a little bit dated, but probably quite relevant. And linked to the human rights conversation, I think we need to be better at speaking about human rights. I think a lot of the hashtags that you mention are actually synonyms to human rights, and I think we need to be, if that's what we want in terms of laws and norms, then we need to speak about laws and norms more explicitly. On the peacekeeping bit, I think one of the issues that we've seen, and it hasn't been mentioned sufficiently, is how the counterterrorism narrative has displaced human rights in civil society and has been a problem for peacekeeping. The UN, if it wants to promote peace, needs to stop promoting securitized and militarized narratives and responses to conflicts that are human issues, not anything else. The private sector, I think, is mentioned in a lot of different spaces, and I think we've lagged behind in how to restrain some of the private sector's actions and have seen them as cash cows rather than as part of the problem and necessarily part of the solution too. So I think that's still some of the conversations that have happened. And again, we've been talking about some of those issues when it comes to the private sector in linking it to the arms sort of trade. And when you talk about transparency, I think there is a role for businesses to show that they are doing human rights due diligence, that they also have remedy processes, not necessarily opening the black box of state security, but to prove that they have a process would be the first step in transparency.
That was almost 8. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. Please, yes.
Hi, Rachel from Interpeace. We often talk about how in peace building the process is as important, if not more so, than the outcome, especially when it comes to legitimacy and sustainability of solutions. And I'm wondering, in the case of the Summit of the Future and the 13 tracks that you outlined, how important is the process? And to what degree is there a risk that the process itself ends up reflecting some of the same shortcomings of multilateralism and the power dynamic that the process itself seeks to remedy? Thanks.
I think one more before handing over to our colleagues. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Ambassador, Permanent Representative to Georgia to Geneva-based international organizations. Thanks again for this very important and very timely discussion. I have some comments and questions. So UPR for conflict prevention was mentioned. From my humble point of view, there is no need to invent anything new. There is a that need to be in compliance with existing that mechanisms. And Thomas, Ambassador Greminger remembered very well from his huge experience from Vienna that there is a conflict prevention center, there are CSBMs, but unfortunately they did not bring concrete results when it comes to situation in Ukraine. When the war erupted, we are chairing the Permanent Council, and we remember very well, regardless your efforts, we could not succeed, and this conflict went further, and unfortunately we are witnessing now the biggest tectonic threat emerged again in Europe, and there is an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. So the question is the following. If we go back to history, we see that the creation of the international system was the outcome of the huge wars, the First War and the Second War, and this system was created by the winners. The provisions are excellent, but again, there is an issue of compliance. I think that it's high time to start thinking about the future and outcome of the war between Russia and Ukraine, what will be the influence of this war for the existing security architecture in Europe, and would be the need of new Helsinki or even new San Francisco? This is kind of provocative question, but I think that it's high time to start thinking about it. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
It's coming.
Who would like? Yes, Richard.
So, Ambassador, on your last point, I gave a speech for GCSP actually online last year where I said, is this a new San Francisco moment? And my conclusion was you only get San Francisco moments after wars between the major powers, direct wars between the major powers. So we could have a new San Francisco moment, but we'll all be dead. Because if we have a war between the major powers, we know how that ends. So I don't believe that egregious, appalling, and I think historically crucial as it is, I don't believe Russia's war on Ukraine, as long as it remains within its current limits, creates the conditions for a new San Francisco moment, but it does clearly create an impetus for looking at what is wrong with the current system. A war over Taiwan might have a more decisive effect and might open up space for discussions, but again, it's a rather high risk to run. On the question of the process, I think there is a concern that one concern at the moment is that the major powers are not necessarily very bought into a lot of the processes around the Summit of the Future. That it tends to be being driven by middle powers, Germany, the Netherlands, and so forth. The P5, clearly the P5 are not in a position to come to a joint position on what they want out of UN reform. But I'm not sure that the US and others have really decided what they want out of this process. Simultaneously, the G77 countries, as Adam said, are very skeptical of a lot of this process because they want to focus solely on the SDGs. So I think there are a number of political problems. I think there is also a problem, which is that outside New York and outside roughly the people in this room, nobody knows that this is going on. If you were to walk out onto any street in any capital city and said, "Are you excited for the summit of the future?" people would say, "What are you? What is this strange science fiction thing you're talking about?" And I do think that the UN is going to have to make a bit of a push, similar to pushes it's made in the past around the SDGs, to try and create a bit more public excitement about this thing before September 2024, because otherwise it feels very much like inside baseball. Lastly, Florence, on your point about the counter-terrorism narrative, I do touch on this in the paper. I mean, the Secretary-General says that he wants the UN to fund African-led peace enforcement operations. And I think there is a logic for that in places such as the Sahel. But as Crisis Group has argued and the paper argues, you can't just talk about funding new peace enforcement operations. That has to be balanced with a focus on governance, on peace building. And it's very important that the new Agenda for Peace gets that balance right, because otherwise you're actually encouraging what could be counterproductive forces.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely fundamental. I think there is a lot of political pressure, not least on the Secretary-General, because there is, we see African governments turning to Wagner instead of turning to the UN for help. And then, of course, the quick answer would be to say, yeah, we need to have more multilateral peace enforcement capacities, but I think this would be a terrible shortcut. That might indeed be necessary, but I think peace enforcement alone will not, solve the problems of lack of governance, inequality, for that matter, in lack of, political leadership in some of the sub-Saharan countries. On kind of creating new institutions instead of, carefully mapping what exists already, I think you're totally right. There is this temptation by politicians, also by diplomats, because of course we, are searching for limelight, we're searching for political attention by creating something new. There are some heads of states, around the globe that are experts in, trying to come up with brilliant ideas on things that do already exist, but somehow, don't work as good as we would wish. I think we need to be careful. But at times, I would say if there is political momentum, we should go for it for the sake of the impact. And so I know this is a bit a diplomatic answer, but I would still, support it. Yeah, I mean, your question, this is, of course, compliance is absolutely key, and we need to insist on compliance. And if there is no will to comply, then you can do a lot of things and they won't work. For instance, this idea of strengthening regional organizations, if you kind of transfer the same issues that you have on the global level down to the regions, it won't work down on the regional level just because you have transferred it a level down. And, or to put it more bluntly, of course, you have wonderful regional organizations like the one I worked for many years at the OEC that are, for the time being, at least on important issues, totally blocked because of the polarization, because key stakeholders are not willing to use it. And so in that sense, if there is this lack of political will, I think, the best tools won't work. And having said so, I would still argue, you have, for instance, speaking about the OEC, you have a number of fantastic tools that are at times, discovered in other regions as being very interesting, and are then, at least for a while, more appreciated by, for instance, ASEAN has been for a while very interested in the conflict management toolbox of the OSCE, CSPMs, etc. I mean, it was a fluctuating interest, but there was an interest. And I think giving more global attention to some of these tools that have worked for a long time in certain regions would make a lot of sense in my view. And some of the things that I read in the high-level advisory report reminds me indeed very much of some of the tools. I mean, one of the proposals, is kind of making a global CPC, at least the Conflict Prevention Center of the, and when it comes to transparency, in terms of weapons, and I think again you have a fantastic toolbox that is currently, unfortunately, totally underutilized in the Euro-Atlantic area. But you would have something that has worked for a while and could be reinvigorated again.
And before handing over, I know that our next person wanted to raise a question. It really reminds how interesting we have the different multilateral framework, whether it's the UN or AU or NATO or EU, and they have all in the past 2 years obviously fundamentally changed and been transformed. And it also speaks to, it doesn't matter what the framework of the organization, really how they look like, because it all comes down to politics. We saw NATO, very capable, but unsuccessful in Afghanistan, and then you have OSCE, which is obviously has been severely undermined, but now coming forward as a model for the future in the report. So it's very interesting that we all, having kind of studied this for the past 30 years, but in the last just year or so, it requires us to step back and think about there's the politics, and then there's the mechanics, the concepts, the programs, and what is working and not. And I know that many people are working on it, and of course, very much appreciating that the issue of peace operations comes up, because it's, to me, it was extraordinary that it was not part of the conversation when it's kind of the biggest problem in many ways, but it's kind of finding its way forward. And that one is a good segue to our next colleague, because our GCSP fellow from Cameroon, Dr. Aissi, you also led a very useful conversation a couple of days ago, also on the African Union and the future. And of course, this is one area where now with the what finally tends to be a breakthrough in the long-standing question of funding AU operations, it is happening. But then the question comes up: where will they go, and how will what will be the bigger impact, which both Ambassador and Richard touched upon? That was a very long segue into you. You're next, actually. So, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Mr. Aissi, former GCSP fellow and former UN staff. I worked with the UN Office for Central Africa in Gabon, and before that with the UN Office for West Africa in Dakar. From what I got as impression in this two region is that in September next year, many African populations expect to have a new common agenda for the planet, but at the same time, new agenda for peace in Africa. Because of these two gaps, Africa has we discussed 2 days ago, one of the most sophisticated agenda for peace on the planet. The African peace and security architecture in terms of institutions, in terms of mechanism. At the same time, this is a continent which is one of the most affected by conflicts. So the issue of a new agenda for peace in Africa should be centrally organized. The second reason is that Africa concentrates more than 80% of UN resources on peacekeeping. More than 80% of the 6 billion budget, and more than 80% of all the peacekeeping personnel deployed on the planet. At the same time, as the Secretary-General Guterres said, peacekeeping does not work anymore. So we need something new. Something new we need a new agenda. And this brings me to my question. I think for this summit, there's a lot of hope that we will come with a new modes of intervention. And I think in the report, you call it new generation of peace enforcement mission. Again, when you discuss with not the population of peace enforcement, politicians in Africa, many of them are very cautious about the word intervention for two reasons. For political reason, many African countries, they see themselves as a potential site of peace enforcement. Because for internal tension. And the second reason is much more historical. Many African leaders in the population are still traumatized by what happened in Libya. So if you need a new agenda for peacekeeping, if you need a post-peacekeeping agenda for preventive diplomacy, I think the word intervention and enforcement should disappear from our ambitions and our analysis. And my question is, how do you see this problem being addressed in September next year, when I'm going to speak about the new agenda for peace in Africa, without making sure that African countries cooperate, are willing to go toward this new agenda for prevention? Thank you.
I'll take a few more. We had, yes, now I'm trying to remember. We go this way, that way, yes.
Hello, thank you for discussion. I'm Anila Yelisevich. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in GCSP. My question would be, I mean, we are seeing that we have a kind of prioritization of priorities. So first it started with COVID, now it's continuing with Ukraine. And every region has the feeling to be prioritized. We have Africa, not to mention other regions. So my question would be, for now, for the future, since we are speaking about, are the United Nations going to, again, prioritize the priorities? And what will be the criteria for that if they do that? And if not, are they going to deal with all challenges which are treated as priorities? Do they have mechanism for that? And what would be the role of the major powers in their dependency or independency dealing with such issues? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Prioritize the priorities. Challenging, though. Yes.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm Natalie Shaw. I'm the director of the GCAP, the Geneva Centre for Security Sector Governance. So obviously very happy with the comments on governance. But I have a couple of candid questions, if I may. Richard, you spoke about the setback on certain agenda, including women, peace and security, and it's time to get serious. And I mean, I fully highlight that, and I'm super happy with that. But for me, the question is, what is the difference now? And I mean, how can we support that? That would be my first part. And the second part is a bit other stakeholders, and it was a little bit touched upon by certain colleagues earlier. I mean, obviously, it's an intergovernmental process, but there are other voices out there. You spoke about like regional organization, but what about cities, civil societies? What is their role? And yeah, what are your views on that? Thank you.
Shall we? We have a final one, and then we have going to actually wrap up. I realize, wow, time is flying, so very short.
Right. Yeah, I want to pick up the point. First of all, I'm Conrad from the Simon Institute. I want to pick up on the point of inequality in power and impact, and I think we should focus actually less on individuals and maybe just on the two multinationals currently building foundation models for AI systems that will probably power large parts of the economy going forward, and thereby also of our security systems, our political systems, etc. Which means we need AI forensics, we need AI assurance, accountability mechanisms. And all of these are discussions that can't just be had at the national level, so we can't really avoid this question that easily. And I think the question is how to get organizations like ISO, ITU, WIPO, etc. in spaces like these, such that they participate in this security discussion, because that is the future of multilateralism that we might already be able to create in Geneva as a first step, and then also move beyond it. But I don't really see this happening, so I would just be interested in your take on how this might come about.
Thank you so much. That was a range of questions. No, now we're absolutely overdue. Sorry, I lost focus. And of course, you will all be able to read the policy papers. I'm giving you the floor very shortly. I just want to say that the conversation will continue. And of course, we still have a year and 5 months until the summit. So there's still opportunities to re-engage on the topic and follow up. But a very quick one on feedback on that one. And then also include your concluding thought. What's the takeaway, the main takeaway from this morning conversation? Planning, preparing for the summit of the future?
So on peace enforcement in Africa, the phrase you refer to, a new generation of peace enforcement operations, that's a phrase which Antonio Guterres is using. So, I mean, blame him. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think this links to Florence's point. You know, people are talking about, oh, we're just going to do peace enforcement operations. And there are so many difficulties and dangers around that approach. And I think we need to be careful, and we need to think about what sort of operations African countries want to lead, what sort of operations are actually going to lead to stability, and how we best support that. I do think that the next 1 year and 5 months are a political opportunity for the African members of the UN to make their security concerns heard. There are two reasons for that. One is that there is a very high awareness in New York that, you know, peace operations like MINUSMA in Mali are not delivering. And, you know, we are seeing a rise in violence in the Sahel in particular. And also, much more cynically, everyone wants African votes in the General Assembly when there are votes on Ukraine. And actually, that has given the African group a surprising amount of additional leverage. So I do hope that for this mix of reasons, you know, the African group can come forward through the process leading to the summit of the future and sort of lay out a broad range of demands and requests and ideas about what the continent needs in terms of security support. And that may be robust operations in part, but it's not only robust operations, as you know. Prioritizing priorities. Look, we've touched on this already. I think for the time being, the G77 countries have made it clear that they have one priority, which is catching up on the Sustainable Development Goals. And, you know, we live in a world where we are not going to meet the 2030 targets by 2030. But I think the G77 are completely right to say that we have seen backsliding on many of the SDGs related to the economic shocks of COVID and Ukraine. And the G77 want to see a successful SDG summit this year. If we get a successful SDG summit, then there may be more opportunities to talk about these other priorities. But I think we have to get a successful SDG summit first. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of rancor, and it's not going to be possible to get reforms on other fronts. I think on the women, peace and security agenda, the focus now has to be on implementation. I mean, further normative development through the Security Council is almost entirely impossible in terms of resolutions. But we are seeing activity by countries such as Switzerland to work on making women's inclusion in peace processes more of a reality. In very practical terms, next month during the Swiss presidency of the Council, I think certainly every briefing where there's a civil society briefer, at least one of the briefers will be a woman. And actually, I think in most cases they will all be women. So it's, you know, steps like that that can finally lead us towards actually making good on all the resolutions that we passed. And then lastly, on AI, look, I'm one of the last 6% of people who live in the US who don't carry a cell phone. So actually, I'm safe from our robot overlords. But I'm not qualified to get into the details of the AI discussion. But I think what a big political event like the Summit of the Future can do is be a platform for leaders to sort of give political direction to multilateral agencies to start getting their act together. I mean, the summit of the future will not resolve how we deal with AI, but if you find a consensus saying we do need to have a bigger international discussion about the governance of AI, that can come from the leaders level in New York, and then you bring it to Geneva. And my final takeaway from this discussion is that I remain like Sting. I'm an Englishman in New York and I'm going to stay there. But I should be coming to Geneva more often because I think a lot of the technical aspects of, especially the disarmament and arms control aspects of the new agenda for peace are going to be sorted out here rather than back across the Atlantic. So that's my takeaway.
Wonderful. Thanks for that happy ending. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Well, that one. So just very briefly, a few thoughts. But of course, each of the topics raised, they would actually, deserve a much deeper discussion. On the women, peace and security agenda, I think we should implementation. I think that's very important. Focus on the impact and prevents us from using the narrative in an ideological sense. There is this risk, that this becomes part of the new Cold War. This is part of the Western versus the Russian ideology, and I think we should try to get out of that trap. I saw that very much in an OEC setting, but I also see it globally. So insist, on the impact by women's inclusion. For instance, I argued, let's look at the difference between a special monitoring mission to Ukraine patrol that is mixed as opposed to an only male patrol. And clearly the performance of the mixed patrol is much better. And I think that's the kind of argument that would allow us to overcome this ideological issue and trap. Prioritize the priorities. I think one approach here is to empower regional organizations. And I think per se, of course, this is a good idea. But again, as I said before, if you basically have on a regional level the same actors that are stuck on the global level, it's not going to work. And I mean, again, the OEC, unfortunately, being the example. In 2014, when we dealt with the crisis, what we then called the crisis in and around Ukraine, there was a resolve by key stakeholders, Washington, Moscow, Brussels, to kind of engage the OEC as a conflict manager. And we managed, to do so, at least for a while. Today, the situation is totally different. You have key stakeholders, that have gone to war. Obviously, there is no space for a regional organization. So there are limits to that, but I would advocate the idea of, delegating, empowering regional organizations. And lastly, I think about African peace and security in Africa. I think, yes, all these multidimensional, heavy footprint operations, they're under a lot of criticism. I think we have to look very carefully on what works and what does not. Try to make sure that, by kind of replacing these heavy footprint operations through something lighter, that we don't create a vacuum. I think that would be, many of these operations have a stabilization function. If this all of a sudden is gone, this carries risks. And I think this needs to be properly assessed. So I would advocate to be careful. When it comes to the focus on enforcement, I think we discussed this before. While I have a preference to use the African Union to Wagner, to be a bit blunt, but at the same time, we also have to watch out. Enforcement is often a shortcut to not dealing with serious governance deficits, and I think, and then it won't work. Enforcement won't work. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and dear colleagues. Thank you so much for taking the time to joining us this morning. I was going to say afternoon, but it's morning still. And also very much thanks, Richard, in particular, for your roadmap towards the future and highlighting these things. And the policy brief, it was both timely, concrete, and concise. I realize pragmatic being the new bold. And also very much thank you, Ambassador Greminger, for engaging and sharing your reflections on the topic as such, but also, of course, specifically the propositions made by Richard's paper. I also like to thank everyone for engaging so actively with the questions, and also Adam for sharing on the high-level panel report. Very helpful, very insightful. And last but absolutely anything but least, I'd like to thank my colleagues who's made it all happen. Tobias Westner and his team, of course. And Zoe, where are you? Here's Zoe. She is the one who is the coordinator for this event. Zoe Venete, she's new with us and done an absolutely fantastic job. And also we have Florian behind us. So lots of colleagues in the rooms. And then there's many more who is not here. So thanks everyone for coming, and I hope you'll have a really good Friday and stay engaged. The Swiss is taking the lead next month in the Security Council. Hopefully some of these issues will make a tiny bit of forward-leaning movement. And if nothing else, everybody everywhere has to, of course, to work on these issues, preparing for the future. So thank you very much and have a good Friday.